On October 4th, 1957, the first space race began with the Soviet launch of Sputnik 1, a basketball-sized satellite housing a single watt-power radio transmitter on an orbit that reached out as far as 560 miles from the Earth's surface. It ended just 12 years and an adjusted 473 billion American dollars later when American astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin traveled nearly 239,000 miles from the Earth's surface to touch down on the moon. Between 1969 and 72, a total of 6 American missions would see human beings traverse the moon's rocky surface, and that is a feat that no nation, including the US, has managed since. And now we find ourselves amid a new space race of sorts, with China's military-led space program quickly developing the means to send its own taikonauts, or Chinese astronauts, to the moon's strategically valuable southern pole, with a target date of 2030. And just like in the last space race, the United States has seen a pretty slow start, with senior NASA officials stating plainly that unless something changes soon, the United States is unlikely to beat China back to the moon. But does that really matter? Is this new 21st century space race a strategic competition, or is it just nationalism wrapped in media hyperbole? If America reached the moon 56 years ago, is there really any reason to invest billions of dollars into racing to prove that it can do it again? That's what I wanted to know when I set out to research this topic, and to be frank, I was pretty surprised by what I learned, because it turns out this modern space race is not only real for both sides, it might actually be a lot more important than the first one. So let's dive into orbital supremacy, the never-ending competition for resources, and the 21st century race to the moon. I'm Alex Hollings. Welcome to Firepower.
Saberblade.
If you're 21 or older, I've got something really cool to share with you. Winglore whiskey. A few fighter pilots with a love for great whiskey and even better stories set out on a mission to bottle the best in bourbon and American single malt, and what they ended up with was Winglore, a craft-driven, aviation-inspired whiskey brand built around premium quality and a community of storytellers. Winglore's founders include guys who flew F-15E Strike Eagles, F-16s, FA-18s, A-4 Skyhawks, and cargo lift platforms, working alongside distillery experts and business moguls to create a whiskey brand that honors the pilot community. If you're over 21, you can learn more about Winglore's team, their whiskey, and the story behind their brand by visiting their site using the link in the description below. And if you're curious about their bigger mission, you can also check out their Join the Squadron page, which explains how supporters like you can become an official member of the Winglore team, including all the eligibility details and legal requirements to do so. Again, this is for legal drinking age audiences only, but if that is you, well, Winglore has a pretty awesome story behind it, and as I've said before, I know they've got a lot more stories to tell. Last week, U.S. Secretary of the Air Force Troy Menck addressed China's rapidly maturing space program at the Space Power Conference in Orlando, where he acknowledged that space is yet another theater in which China has relied heavily on stolen intellectual property and modeling its efforts after successful Western programs. But he also cautioned against writing China's space program off as a result. I'll quote him now. They are copying us in many ways, but don't let that confuse you. They are very, very innovative as well. It's not just copying us. They are super innovative in how they're operating, which puts even more pressure on us to innovate faster. This is a trend American analysts have seen across a breadth of industries, and in the case of this channel in particular, it's something that we've discussed specifically regarding Chinese fighter programs. It's true that China relies on a vast espionage network to help advance its engineering efforts, but it's a beginner-level mistake to assume that's the extent of their goals. China's intellectual property theft has progressed in parallel with massive investments in its education, research, and engineering infrastructure. Rather than focusing solely on, say, copying the design of the F-35 to build their own J-35, China has placed a big emphasis on using that exercise to divine the hard-earned engineering lessons that led to the F-35's development in the first place, so they can then leverage those lessons themselves in their own subsequent designs, aircraft like the J-36 and J-50 that are now in testing. To put it another way, China isn't just copying off of America's math homework, it's using that stolen homework to learn the actual math, creating a new engineering baseline that it can build upon, iterate off of, and innovate in its own ways, leapfrogging over some 3 decades of American research and development. Or, as Chinese spy Su Bin put it in an email to his handlers upon stealing the design documents for the F-22 and the F-35 for China, the information he stole would, quote, allow us to rapidly catch up with US levels, to stand easily on the giant's shoulders. China doesn't want to build a copy of the US military or the American space program. It wants to build its own improved versions. Copying might be a part of the process, but it's far from the culmination of it. China's stated aim is to supplant the United States as the world's preeminent superpower, and it knows it can't do that through copying alone. And it's in that very goal of becoming the most powerful nation on Earth that's led to China's heavy investment into this new space race, both in terms of orbital assets like satellites and further flung targets like the moon. And when I call it a space race, you should know that's not some American-centric hot take from a guy who's just rooting for his home team. That is exactly how Chinese leaders are framing it. In fact, Chinese officials have intentionally drawn direct parallels between its lunar ambitions and its openly illegal claims of sovereignty over vast swaths of the Pacific Ocean. In 2017, the head of China's moon mission, Yi Peijian, appeared on Chinese state television and said in no uncertain terms that, and I quote, the universe is like the ocean. The moon is like the Diaoyu Islands, and Mars is like the Scarborough Shoal. We will be blamed by our descendants if we don't go there, and others get there before us. The Diaoyu Islands, as he put it, are disputed islands some 200 miles off China's coast, but only about 100 miles from Taiwan in the East China Sea, while the Scarborough Shoal is a coral reef atoll inside the Philippines' economic exclusion zone, but that China has laid claim to anyway, despite being more than 500 miles from the nearest Chinese territory. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled that China's claims over the shoal were illegal under international law, and China has just opted to ignore that ruling ever since. China sees these and other disputed islands as strategic positions it can use to militarily take control over tens of thousands of square miles of international waters and territories inside other Pacific nations' economic exclusion zones, granting China access to vast reserves of natural resources that, according to international law, they have no right to. So you can see how it might be troubling to hear officials from China's military-led space program comparing the moon to islands it's trying to literally steal and militarize in order to gain a monopoly on resources. And to be clear, that does appear to be exactly what China is racing to do. Now, there are several resources on the moon that are worthy of direct competition, but none more valuable than the frozen water found in the deep craters of the moon's north and south poles. Now, water is, of course, useful for keeping humans alive, but in broader terms, it's the hydrogen and the oxygen that make up that water that might be most important, because they are vital elements for the creation of rocket fuel. Being able to produce fuel on the moon has huge advantages over doing so on Earth. Rockets could launch from the gravity-dense and atmosphere-heavy Earth, carrying only enough fuel to reach the moon. and then be refueled in lunar orbit for follow-on destinations like Mars. Because this frozen water is only found in specific places near the moon's poles, known as permanently shadowed regions, or PSRs, American and European leaders are rightfully concerned that whoever reaches the moon first in the 21st century will have what's commonly called first mover advantage, which basically means whoever gets there first not only claims the prize, but also gets to dictate norms moving forward. Now, that would not only mean China laying claim to the water reserves on the lunar surface, but also getting to dictate how international relations on that heavenly body are conducted moving forward, giving them the chance to lay claims of sovereignty over strategically important or resource-rich areas, to establish economic exclusion zones for future discoveries, and more. In effect, China gaining control over the moon could result in China keeping control over the moon for the entire foreseeable future, barring some sort of conflict at least. Of course, it is also worth noting that the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which was signed by the US and China, among many others, outright prohibits claims of sovereignty over lunar territory as well as the militarization of space in general. But China's refusal to follow international law regarding Pacific islands that it directly compares to its space aspirations doesn't promote a ton of faith in China's willingness to adhere to international law beyond the confines of Earth's atmosphere. After all, China's military, the People's Liberation Army, formally designated space a warfighting domain all the way back in 2013, and the nation's space program is a joint military effort, meaning there is no differentiation between organizations, unlike how America's civilian NASA program operates independently from the US Space Force. To put it in stark terms, just about every spacefaring organization on the planet sees the moon as a vital stepping stone toward any future deep space endeavors, whether the goal is the asteroid belt or Mars or beyond. And the fear is that China's rapid military expansion and aggressive claims over the Pacific will be mirrored in orbit, with China laying claim to territory that another nation, were they in the same position, would not. In direct contrast to China's approach, the American-led Artemis Accords were signed in 2020 and set out to establish best practices and international norms for the moon before anyone even gets there again. Today, some 57 nations have signed this treaty and pledged to support the Artemis program's moon efforts, predicated on, quote, the benefit for all humankind to be gained from cooperating in the peaceful use of outer space. The accord emphasizes adherence to the Outer Space Treaty that would bar any nation from laying a permanent claim to lunar territory or deploying military assets to assert sovereignty, while still allowing for things like resource extraction. And that brings me to the part of this video where I need to address the comments that I already know are pouring in from those who view the United States as a looming global villain and who may not be aware of China's aggressive and often illegal activities on the world stage. These folks will argue that America claims it's interested in mutual cooperation in space, but in reality, it's using its soft power to lure ally and partner nations into its effort to expand the American hegemony to the moon and back. They will tell you that at its core, America is pursuing its own interests. So of course it would be concerned about China stealing its moon landing thunder. And they'll argue that Uncle Sam's welcoming demeanor is more about distributing the immense cost of lunar operations between countries than it is about true space-based diplomacy. And I'm going to tell you the truth. They could be right on every count. There really are two sides to every geopolitical effort from every nation. The front-facing diplomatic side that's focused on good outcomes and mutual cooperation, and the quieter, less overt strategic side that leverages every international development as a means to jockey for position in global competition. I have absolutely no doubt that the Artemis program and accords are no exception to the standard, but that doesn't mean an American-led victory in this 21st century space race would be bad news for anybody. other than maybe China and the 17 mostly developing nations that they've managed to convince to sign on to their moon program. Or, as I've put it in the past, fair doesn't exist in the macro scope of geopolitical competition, and it is vital to understand that China is just as aware of that fact as the United States is. You can accuse Uncle Sam of dirty boxing to get his way, and 9 times out of 10, I'll probably even agree with you. But if you refuse to apply that same model of self-serving cynicism to Chinese efforts, then you aren't doing analysis work, you're defending a bias. At the end of the day, the future of humanity's efforts in space will very likely be largely dictated by the norms established by whoever plants their flag on the moon next. One nation has sought to involve as much of the democratic world in its efforts as possible, working to establish guidelines by which lunar cooperation could come to define the world's space endeavors for a century or more to come. And the other has openly compared the moon to territories that it aims to lay claim to and militarize. Even if you don't completely trust the former, it does still sound a heck of a lot better than the latter. But I suppose the bigger question is, just how important is the moon really when it comes to the balance of strategic power in the decades ahead? Now, is it worth investing hundreds of billions of dollars to get there first, to establish cooperative norms for resource extraction and continue on to greater challenges like Mars and beyond? Or should the Western world let China claim ownership over the whole thing and just be done with it? As always, the answer is complicated, and this time, it also depends a bit on where your personal priorities lie. Ceding the moon to China could lead to orbital disadvantages in the long run, as China's space presence swells in the absence of competition. Technologies developed in the pursuit of establishing permanent or semi-permanent colonies on the moon could quickly provide China with the means to erode or erase America's technological advantages in military or commercial domains. And maybe most immediately, a Chinese victory in this modern space race could end with immense soft power advantages in all the same ways it did last time, demonstrating China's increased technological power and substantiating its ideological and governmental framework to a developing world that China is continuing to pursue as modern spheres of influence. In other words, if China reaches the moon first, it doesn't mean that the sky is falling, but it does mean that portions of it would be under new management. And that leaves me a bit torn. On the one hand, I can't help but stress that the United States military is in serious need of an infusion of funds to replace its Cold War inventories and maintain its deterrent edge in the years to come. And that is far from the only furnace that Uncle Sam needs to be shoveling his money into lately. You could argue that there are other lines of effort more deserving of funding, other threats more pressing, or other goals more worthy of pursuit. And depending on the effort, the threat, or the goal, I might agree. But the problem with these discussions is that we're comparing immediate concerns with distant what-ifs that are admittedly predicated on a dozen variables that we can't even make out quite yet. Today, we may well feel like the Navy's shipbuilding problems are way more pressing than NASA's rockets. But in 50 years, we might look back at ceding the moon to China as our nation's greatest strategic blunder. From this far out, it's just genuinely hard to say. But I will admit that the Marine in me says that we should never just willingly surrender the high ground. So what do you think? Is winning the 21st century space race about nothing more than the pursuit of geopolitical bragging points, or is it a vital stepping stone to a democratic future beyond the confines of our world? I may not know for sure, but you can bet one thing: I'll be rooting for the astronauts aboard the first crewed Artemis launch this coming February. And with that, ends this edition of Firepower from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.